The ballroom at Harcourt House glittered with the light of 1,000 candles on the evening of April 12th, 1814, their flames reflected in crystal chandeliers that cast dancing shadows across silk wallpaper and the jewelled throats of London's most distinguished ladies. Yet Eleanor Whitmore noticed none of this splendour as she stood in her customary position beside a potted fern, her pale blue gown marking her as clearly as a sign might have done, for this dress had seen 3 seasons now, and the more observant matrons knew it well, knew too that the Whitmore family's modest townhouse on the unfashionable side of Mayfair spoke to circumstances that grew more strained with each passing year. She touched her mother's pearl earrings, her only inheritance from a woman dead these 5 years, and watched her younger sister Caroline twirl across the dance floor in the arms of James Ashworth, whose golden hair caught the candlelight and whose laugh rang out with the easy confidence of a man who had never known a moment's true worry in all his 27 years. The sight should have pained Eleanor, this public display of attention toward her prettier sister, yet she held within her breast a secret that transformed the scene entirely, for James had spent the past 2 months calling upon her in private, slipping notes beneath her door, meeting her in quiet corners where no one thought to look for the plain elder Whitmore daughter. "She is rather unfortunate-looking, is she not?" came a whisper from behind the fern, and Eleanor recognized the nasal tones of Mrs. Agnes Chamberlain without needing to turn. One might almost feel sorry for her if she did not insist on appearing season after season like some sad ghost haunting the edges of every gathering. A second voice, younger and crueler, replied that at 23 Eleanor Whitmore was quite firmly on the shelf and ought to have the decency to remain at home rather than remind everyone of what awaited daughters whose fathers could not provide proper dowries. Eleanor's cheeks burned, but she kept her expression smooth, for she had learned long ago that showing pain only encouraged such cruelty, and besides, these women did not know what she knew, could not guess that James Ashworth, brother to the formidable Duke of Ravenscroft himself, had pressed her hand just yesterday and spoken of futures and promises and matters too precious to share with anyone. The Duke, she had heard, rarely attended social functions, preferring the solitude of his vast estate to the frivolity of the season, and Eleanor had never once exchanged words with him, knowing him only as a distant figure of stern reputation and immense consequence. But James was different, warm where his brother was cold, attentive where society was dismissive, and when Eleanor caught his eye across the ballroom and saw him incline his head almost imperceptibly toward the garden doors, her heart seized with sudden wild hope. She slipped away while Mrs. Chamberlain continued her dissection of other unfortunate souls, moving through the mild spring evening toward the gardens where jasmine perfumed the air with sweetness, and James Ashworth waited with promises on his lying tongue. The gardens of Harcourt House stretched before Eleanor like a promise, their winding paths lit by paper lanterns that swayed gently in the mild April breeze, and she followed the glow of James's golden hair through hedgerows heavy with spring blooms until they reached the small summer house tucked away at the garden's furthest corner, a place where the music from the ballroom faded to a distant murmur, and the jasmine grew so thick its perfume seemed to wrap around them like an embrace. "You came," James said, and his voice held such warmth that Eleanor felt her carefully guarded heart crack open despite every lesson life had taught her about hope and its inevitable disappointments. For here was a man who had sought her out when no one else had bothered to look, who had written her letters speaking of her wit and her quiet grace when the rest of the world saw only a plain face and an empty dowry. "I have thought of nothing but you these past weeks," he continued, taking her hands in his and drawing her into the shadows of the summer house where moonlight filtered through latticed windows and cast silver patterns across the worn wooden floor, and Eleanor trembled not from cold, but from the terrifying vulnerability of wanting something so desperately she could taste it. He spoke then of futures and promises, of how he would call upon her father tomorrow, how the disparity in their circumstances meant nothing to him, how he had watched her for months before finding the courage to approach, and each word fell upon Eleanor's starving soul like rain upon parched earth. She knew she should be cautious, knew that men of his station did not typically marry women of hers, yet when he pressed his lips to her forehead and then to her mouth, she found herself answering with a passion born of 23 years of invisibility, suddenly shattered by the miracle of being seen. The ribbon he drew from his pocket was crimson silk, and he tied it around her wrist with fingers that shook slightly, calling it a token of his pledge, a promise made tangible, and Eleanor believed him because she needed to believe, because the alternative was returning to her life of fern-adjacent wallflower existence and whispered cruelties and watching her sister dance while she slowly withered into spinsterhood. What happened next in the darkness of that summer house was something Eleanor would relive in memory countless times in the weeks to come, the gentleness that became urgency, the promises whispered against her skin, the moment she surrendered everything she had been taught to guard, because James Ashworth had made her feel, for the first time in her life, like someone worth choosing. Afterward, as she straightened her gown and noticed with distant alarm the torn lace on her sleeve that she would need to hide, James kissed her once more and spoke words that sealed her fate. "Tomorrow," he said, "I shall speak with your father first thing, and by week's end all of London will know you are to be my wife." Eleanor walked back to the ballroom alone, the crimson ribbon hidden beneath her glove, jasmine clinging to her hair, believing herself transformed. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The morning of May 28, 1814, arrived wrapped in grey rain that streaked down the window panes of Eleanor's modest bedroom like tears she refused to shed, and she lay in her narrow bed listening to the persistent rhythm of water against glass, while her stomach churned with the familiar nausea that had plagued her for 2 weeks now, a sickness she could no longer attribute to bad fish or nervous disposition, or any of the other explanations she had desperately constructed in the privacy of her own mind. She pressed her hand flat against her belly, still unchanged to the eye, but harboring a truth that would destroy everything she had ever known, and she thought of James Ashworth, who had not called upon her father the morning after the ball as he had promised, nor the day after that, nor any day in the 6 weeks since he had whispered words of love against her skin in that jasmine-scented summer house. She had written him 3 letters, each more desperate than the last, and received nothing in return but silence so complete it seemed designed to erase her very existence from his memory. Rising slowly to avoid the worst of the dizziness, Eleanor moved to her dressing table and opened the small drawer where she kept her few treasures, pushing aside a pressed flower and a letter from her dead mother until her fingers found the crimson ribbon James had tied around her wrist, this token of his pledge now mocking her with its cheerful colour amid the grey morning light. The rain continued its relentless assault as she dressed herself in a worn house dress, unable to face her maid's curious eyes, and she was sitting by the window watching droplets race each other down the glass when Caroline burst in without knocking, her pretty face animated with gossip she was clearly dying to share. "You will never guess who Margaret Harcourt saw at Lord Pemberton's country gathering last weekend," Caroline announced, throwing herself onto Eleanor's bed with the careless grace of a girl who had never known true trouble, and Eleanor's heart seized in her chest even before her sister continued. "James Ashworth, of all people, looking perfectly delightful and dancing with every pretty girl in attendance, though Margaret says he seemed most attentive to Lady Sophia Lennox, whose dowry is rumoured to be £30,000. Caroline prattled on about dresses and dances, oblivious to the way Eleanor's face had drained of what little colour remained, oblivious to the way her sister's hands gripped the windowsill until her knuckles went white, oblivious to everything except her own reflection in the rain-darkened glass. When Caroline finally left to dress for breakfast, Eleanor remained motionless for a long moment before moving with sudden purpose to her writing desk, where she penned a brief note inquiring about the whereabouts of Mr. James Ashworth, addressing it to the only source who might provide answers. She would go to Ravenscroft House herself, if necessary, would humble herself before the fearsome Duke, if that was what it took, for the alternative was a ruin so complete that even her imagination could not encompass its edges, and the child growing inside her deserved at least the attempt. The afternoon of June 1st, 1814, found Eleanor standing before the imposing facade of Ravenscroft House, her grey travelling dress modest and plain against the grandeur of the townhouse that rose before her like a monument to everything she could never hope to possess, and she hesitated on the rain-dampened steps for a long moment before summoning the courage to lift the heavy brass knocker and announce her presence to whatever fate awaited within. The butler who answered regarded her with barely concealed disdain, his eyes cataloguing her worn gloves and the unfashionable cut of her pelisse, before informing her that Mr. James Ashworth was not in residence. But when Eleanor asked if she might leave a message or learn where he could be found, the man's expression shifted to something approaching pity, and he admitted her to the entrance hall with instructions to wait while he consulted with His Grace the Duke. Eleanor had not expected Frederick Ashworth to be home, had hoped to avoid entirely the formidable figure whose reputation for cold severity preceded him into every drawing-room in London. But she was given no choice when a footman appeared to escort her through corridors lined with dark wood panelling and generations of Ashworth ancestors staring down from gilded frames until she found herself standing in a study that smelled of leather and tobacco and masculine authority. He rose from behind an enormous mahogany desk as she entered, still dressed in riding clothes that spoke of recent exertion, his dark hair slightly disordered, and his jaw set in lines that suggested her interruption was unwelcome, and Eleanor felt her carefully rehearsed words dissolve like morning mist under the weight of his penetrating gaze. "I am told you seek my brother," the Duke said without preamble, his voice carrying the particular quality of ice over stone that made lesser souls tremble and flee, and Eleanor forced herself to meet his eyes despite the trembling in her knees and the nausea that had nothing to do with her condition and everything to do with terror. "I must speak with Mr. Ashworth on a matter of some urgency," she managed, and was proud that her voice emerged steady, even as her hands clutched each other so tightly her knuckles ached. The Duke's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly as he studied her, taking in her pallor and the shadows beneath her eyes and the desperate dignity with which she held herself, and something flickered across his features too quickly for Eleanor to interpret before his expression returned to its customary granite. "My brother left for the continent 3 weeks past," he said, and his gaze dropped to the letter lying open on his desk, a letter Eleanor could not read, but which bore James's careless handwriting across its surface. "He has requested funds be forwarded to Paris and given no indication of when he intends to return to England." The words struck Eleanor like physical blows, each one driving deeper into the fragile hope she had carried with her through the rain-soaked streets, and she felt the blood drain from her face as the full horror of her situation crystallized into undeniable reality. The Duke was watching her still, his keen eyes missing nothing of her reaction, and Eleanor saw the moment suspicion began to dawn behind his cold facade, saw his gaze drop almost involuntarily to her midsection before returning to her stricken face with new and terrible understanding. The silence that followed the Duke's unspoken accusation stretched between them like a living thing, and Eleanor felt the last vestiges of her carefully maintained composure begin to crack under the weight of his knowing gaze, his eyes that had seen through every desperate pretense she had constructed to protect herself from the truth of her own ruin. "You are with child," Frederick said, and it was not a question, but a statement of fact delivered in that same cold voice, though Eleanor detected something beneath the ice now, something that might have been fury or might have been pity. She could not tell which would be worse to bear. She opened her mouth to deny it, to craft some final desperate lie that might preserve what little remained of her dignity, but the words died unspoken when she saw the way he was looking at her, not with the disgust she had expected, but with a terrible understanding that stripped away all possibility of deception. "Yes," she whispered, and the single syllable cost her everything, her reputation, her future, her foolish dreams of love, all of it crumbling to dust in the space of that one damning admission. "Your Grace, your brother promised me marriage. He swore he would speak to my father. He gave me this as a token of his pledge." Her trembling fingers reached into her reticule and withdrew the crimson ribbon, that hateful scrap of silk that had once seemed so romantic, and now served only as evidence of her own stupidity, and she held it out toward the Duke like a penitent offering proof of her sins. Frederick's jaw tightened visibly as he recognized the ribbon, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides, the knuckles going white with the force of whatever emotion he was suppressing behind that granite facade, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped to something low and dangerous that made Eleanor take an involuntary step backward. "My brother," he said, and the words dripped with a contempt so profound it seemed to darken the very air of the study, "has always possessed a remarkable talent for making promises he never intended to keep." Outside the tall windows, thunder rumbled in the distance, the storm that had threatened all day finally gathering strength, and Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes, even as she refused to let them fall, refused to give this cold aristocrat the satisfaction of witnessing her complete dissolution. "I did not come here seeking charity," she managed, her voice stronger now, despite everything. "I came seeking only information about Mr. Ashworth's whereabouts, so that I might remind him of his obligations." Frederick studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression as he took in her squared shoulders and lifted chin, the dignity she clung to even as her world collapsed around her, and when he finally moved, it was to stride toward the door with sudden purpose. "Wait here," he commanded without looking back, and then he was gone, leaving Eleanor alone in that imposing study with only the approaching thunder and the portraits of disapproving Ashworth ancestors for company, wondering what fresh catastrophe awaited her next. The drawing room into which a footman escorted Eleanor 30 minutes later was considerably warmer than the study, a fire blazing in the grate despite the season, and she stood before it with her hands extended toward the flames, trying to still the trembling that had overtaken her entire body, while the untouched cup of tea on the side table grew cold, and the storm outside hurled rain against the windows with enticing fury. She did not know what she was waiting for, did not know why the Duke had commanded her to remain when surely the only sensible course was to send her away with whatever pittance might salve his conscience, and she was so lost in her own despairing thoughts that she did not hear the door open behind her until Frederick's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and she turned to find him standing just inside the doorway, his expression as unreadable as ever, though something had shifted in the set of his shoulders, some decision reached in the 30 minutes of her solitary waiting. "I have considered your situation, and I find there is only one acceptable solution." Eleanor braced herself for whatever charity he meant to offer, already composing the words of dignified refusal that would allow her to retreat with some small shred of pride intact. But nothing could have prepared her for what came next. Nothing in her 23 years of quiet disappointment and careful resignation could have anticipated the words that fell from the Duke of Ravenscroft's lips with all the warmth of a legal pronouncement. "You will marry me," he said, "this evening." And the clock on the mantel chose that precise moment to chime 4 times, each strike echoing through the room like a death knell or perhaps a reprieve. Eleanor could not determine which. "Your Grace," she breathed, certain she had misheard, certain the stress of the day had finally driven her to madness. "I do not understand." Frederick moved further into the room, his posture rigid with the effort of maintaining his composure, and when he spoke again, his voice carried that same quality of ice, though Eleanor thought she detected something beneath it now, something that might have been determination, or might have been resignation to an unpleasant duty. "My brother has dishonored you," he said, "and in doing so has dishonored the Ashworth name, and I will not permit a child of my blood to be born a bastard, regardless of the circumstances of its conception." Before Eleanor could formulate a response, before she could protest or accept or even fully comprehend what was being offered, the drawing-room door burst open to admit a woman of perhaps 60 years, her travelling cloak dripping rainwater onto the carpet, and her sharp eyes taking in the scene before her with immediate and uncomfortable understanding. "Frederick," Lady Beatrice Ashworth announced, removing her wet gloves with brisk efficiency, "I received your message and came at once, and I see the situation is precisely as dire as you suggested." She turned her penetrating gaze upon Eleanor, assessing her from head to toe, before nodding once with grim satisfaction. "She has good bones and a sensible expression," Lady Beatrice declared, "and she has not fainted or become hysterical, which speaks well of her character. The marriage should proceed tonight." The private chapel at Ravenscroft House stood at the far end of the east wing, a small sanctuary of stone and stained glass that had witnessed generations of Ashworth christenings and funerals and marriages, though Eleanor doubted any previous bride had come to this altar in quite such circumstances, wearing a wrinkled grey travelling dress and carrying the weight of scandal in her womb. The rain continued its relentless assault against the ancient windows, each gust of wind sending rivulets of water cascading down the coloured glass like tears shed by the saints depicted there, and Eleanor thought it fitting that even heaven seemed to weep at this mockery of matrimony. Lady Beatrice had done what she could in the 4 hours since the proposal, procuring a simple veil of antique lace and a spray of white roses from the hothouse, but nothing could disguise the truth of what this ceremony represented. A transaction born of necessity rather than affection, a bargain struck to preserve honour and protect an innocent child from the cruelty of illegitimacy. The elderly chaplain who stood before the altar had served the Ashworth family for 40 years, and if he harboured any opinions about being roused from his evening meal to perform such an irregular service, his weathered face betrayed nothing of it. Eleanor stood beside Frederick before the altar, acutely aware of the vast emptiness of the chapel behind them, where pews that could seat 100 guests held only Lady Beatrice and the butler, who had been pressed into service as a second witness, and she found herself thinking of all the weddings she had imagined as a girl, ceremonies filled with flowers and music, and a bridegroom who looked at her with love rather than grim determination. When the chaplain asked if she would take this man as her husband, Eleanor's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper, the words catching in her throat as she spoke vows she had never expected to speak to a man she barely knew, a man who was sacrificing his freedom and his future prospects for a woman who had given herself to his worthless brother. Her hands trembled so violently that Frederick had to steady them when he placed his signet ring upon her finger, the heavy gold band sliding loosely over her knuckle, far too large for her slender hand but serving its purpose nonetheless, marking her as his property, his responsibility, his duchess. Frederick's own voice remained steady throughout, each response delivered with the same controlled precision he brought to everything, though Eleanor noticed that he did not once meet her eyes during the ceremony. His gaze fixed instead on some point above the chaplain's head, as though he could not bear to look upon the woman he was binding himself to for life. When the chaplain pronounced them man and wife, there was no kiss to seal the union, only a brief nod exchanged between them and the scratch of the pen as they signed the register. And then it was done. Eleanor Whitmore had become Eleanor Ashworth, Duchess of Ravenscroft, and as she stood in that cold chapel with rain lashing the windows and her husband already turning away, she had never felt more alone in her entire life. The Duchess's chambers had been decorated in shades of blue silk and cream damask, elegant appointments chosen by some previous Duchess of Ravenscroft, whose taste Eleanor could not fault even as she stood in the center of the room, feeling like an intruder in another woman's sanctuary. The borrowed nightgown from Lady Beatrice hanging loosely on her frame, and her hair unbound for the first time since girlhood, falling past her shoulders in waves she had always considered too plain to be beautiful. A single candle burned on the bedside table, casting shadows that danced across the silk wallpaper and made the room feel both intimate and threatening. And Eleanor found herself counting her own heartbeats as she waited for what must surely come next, the claiming that was Frederick's right as her husband, regardless of the circumstances that had brought them to this moment. She had prepared herself for this on the carriage ride from the chapel, had steeled her heart against the indignity of submitting to a man who had married her out of duty rather than desire, telling herself that whatever Frederick demanded of her body would be nothing compared to what she had already survived, nothing compared to the shame of carrying another man's child while wearing another man's ring. When the knock came at the connecting door between their chambers, Eleanor flinched despite her resolve, her hands twisting in the fabric of her nightgown as she called out permission to enter, in a voice that betrayed every ounce of the fear she had tried so desperately to conceal. Frederick stepped through the doorway, and Eleanor noticed immediately that something was different about him. His cravat loosened and his coat removed, the first signs of informality she had witnessed from a man who seemed to wear his rigid propriety like armor against the world. He did not approach the bed where Eleanor had positioned herself like a sacrifice upon an altar, instead remaining near the door with his hands clasped behind his back and his expression unreadable in the flickering candlelight. "Your Grace," Eleanor began, but Frederick raised one hand to silence her, and when he spoke his voice carried none of the coldness she had come to expect, only a weariness that made him seem suddenly human in a way he had not before. "I will not touch you," he said, and the words hung in the air between them like a benediction Eleanor had not known she needed. "I did not marry you to force myself upon a woman who has already suffered enough at the hands of an Ashworth, and I will not compound my brother's sins with cruelty of my own." Eleanor stared at him in disbelief, searching his face for some sign of deception or ulterior motive, but finding only that same exhausted sincerity that had stripped away his ducal mask. "When you wish it," Frederick continued, his gaze finally meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "If you ever wish it, you need only say so. But until that day, I will trouble you with nothing more than my name and my protection." He turned then and retreated through the connecting door, closing it softly behind him, and Eleanor stood alone in the blue silk room, listening to the rain that still fell against the windows, and feeling tears stream down her cheeks for the first time since this nightmare had begun. Tears not of sorrow, but of overwhelming relief at the unexpected mercy of a man she had believed incapable of gentleness. The breakfast room at Ravenscroft House occupied a corner of the east wing where morning light streamed through tall windows overlooking the garden, and it was here that Eleanor found herself each day at precisely 10 in the morning, seated across from a husband who remained as much a stranger to her as he had been on the night they wed, their meals together a careful choreography of polite exchanges and studied avoidance that Lady Beatrice observed with increasingly undisguised exasperation from her seat at the foot of the table. 1 week had passed since the wedding, 7 days of navigating the vast halls of Ravenscroft House in gowns that had appeared in her wardrobe without explanation. Simple but finely made dresses that fit her perfectly and bore none of the signs of hasty alteration, and Eleanor suspected Lady Beatrice's hand in this quiet generosity, though no one spoke of it directly. Frederick sat behind his newspaper each morning, the pages forming a barrier between them that Eleanor had learned not to breach, though she noticed that his coffee grew cold while he lingered at the table far longer than any urgent business would require, and she wondered if he too found these awkward silences preferable to the isolation of eating alone. Her morning sickness had settled into a predictable pattern now, a wave of nausea that struck upon waking and faded by mid-morning, and she had learned to request only tea and dry toast at breakfast, a preference Frederick had noted without comment, though she caught him watching her with something like concern when he thought she was not looking. "It is remarkable," Lady Beatrice announced into the silence that morning, "how 2 people can occupy the same room and yet exist in entirely separate worlds. But then I suppose you are both so determined to be miserable that any attempt at conversation would quite spoil the effect." Neither Frederick nor Eleanor responded to this provocation, though Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks and saw Frederick's jaw tighten behind his newspaper. The butler entered before Lady Beatrice could continue her campaign of interference, bearing a silver tray with the Morning Post, and Eleanor watched Frederick's expression shift as he sorted through the letters, his careful composure fracturing for just an instant when he opened one particular missive and read its contents. "James has been seen in Paris," Frederick said, the words dropping into the breakfast room like stones into still water. "Apparently he has been living quite comfortably on the allowance I have been foolish enough to continue sending, and has taken up with a widow of questionable reputation." Eleanor's teacup rattled against its saucer as her hands began to tremble, the name of the man who had ruined her still possessing the power to shake her composure even now that she bore his brother's ring and title. Frederick looked at her then, truly looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not the cold duty she had expected, but a fury so profound it seemed to burn beneath the ice of his control, and she understood suddenly that his anger was not directed at her for bringing scandal to his door, but at James for the wounds he had inflicted upon a woman Frederick had sworn to protect. The library at Ravenscroft House stretched along the entire western wall of the first floor, its shelves reaching from polished floor to coffered ceiling, filled with volumes that represented generations of Ashworth intellectual pursuits, and it was here that Eleanor had taken to spending her afternoons when the rest of the house felt too vast and empty to bear, curled in a leather chair near the window where the grey June light filtered through rain-streaked glass and cast soft shadows across the pages of whatever book she had selected from the seemingly endless collection. She had discovered this sanctuary quite by accident during her second week as Duchess, wandering the halls in search of something to occupy the long hours between breakfast and dinner, and had been drawn to the library by the scent of leather and old paper that reminded her of her father's modest study back home, a comfort she had not known she needed until she found herself surrounded by it. On this particular afternoon, June 22nd by her count, Eleanor had pulled a slim volume of poetry from a shelf near the fireplace, drawn by the gold lettering on the spine that spelled out verses she had loved since girlhood, and she had become so absorbed in the familiar words that she did not hear the door open or notice Frederick's presence until his shadow fell across her page. She startled and began to rise, the book tumbling from her lap. but Frederick waved her back into her seat with a gesture that seemed almost casual, a departure from his usual rigid formality that caught her off guard. "I did not mean to disturb you," he said, bending to retrieve the fallen volume and glancing at its title with an expression Eleanor could not quite read, though she thought she detected surprise in the slight lift of his brows. "You read Cowper," he observed, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like approval. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks as she nodded, explaining that her mother had loved this particular collection and had read from it often during Eleanor's childhood, before illness had stolen both her voice and her life. Frederick moved to the chair opposite hers, the one positioned near the window that she had noticed bore the subtle wear of frequent use, and settled into it with the air of a man returning to familiar territory. And Eleanor realized with a small shock that this must be his chair, his sanctuary, and that she had inadvertently invaded it. They sat in silence for a moment, the rain drumming steadily against the windows, and then Frederick spoke again, asking which poem was her favorite. And Eleanor found herself answering without the careful guard she usually maintained, speaking of verses about solitude and hope, and the quiet courage required to face each new day. The conversation that followed was unlike any they had shared before, moving from poetry to philosophy to the novels Eleanor had consumed voraciously during her years as a wallflower, when books had been her only reliable companions, and when she made an observation about a particularly pompous literary critic that surprised a genuine laugh from Frederick, Eleanor felt something shift between them, some wall beginning to crumble. "You should consider this, room yours," Frederick said as the afternoon light began to fade. "Every volume here is at your disposal." And in his eyes Eleanor glimpsed not duty, but something far more dangerous to her carefully guarded heart. The drawing-room at Lady Seymour's summer gathering blazed with candlelight, and the glitter of jewels as Eleanor stood at the threshold on the evening of July the 15th, her heart hammering against her ribs with such force she feared the sound must be audible to the hundreds of guests who had turned to stare at the Duke of Ravenscroft and his mysterious new bride. And she felt Frederick's hand press firmly against the small of her back, a steadying presence that anchored her when every instinct screamed at her to flee back to the safety of the carriage waiting outside. The Ravenscroft sapphires lay heavy against her collarbone, a magnificent cascade of blue stones that had adorned every Duchess of Ravenscroft for 6 generations, and Eleanor knew that Frederick had insisted she wear them tonight precisely because they announced her status more eloquently than any words could manage. A silent declaration that she belonged at his side regardless of what whispers might suggest otherwise. She could hear those whispers already, hissing through the crowd like wind through dry leaves, fragments of speculation that reached her ears despite the practiced smiles and curtsies of those who approached to offer congratulations on her sudden elevation. "Such a hasty marriage," someone murmured, just loud enough to be heard, and of course one must wonder what necessitated such urgency, for Ravenscroft has never been known for impulsive behavior. Eleanor kept her chin lifted and her expression serene, drawing on every lesson in deportment her mother had ever taught her, though inside she felt herself crumbling beneath the weight of knowing that every suspicious glance contained a kernel of truth she could never acknowledge. Mrs. Agnes Chamberlain stood near the refreshment table in a gown of canary yellow that matched the sharpness of her tongue, her small eyes fixed on Eleanor with the predatory interest of a cat watching a wounded bird. And when Eleanor and Frederick drew near in their circuit of the room, Mrs. Chamberlain's voice cut through the ambient noise with deliberate clarity. "I was just remarking to Lady Harrington that the Duke has always been so particular in his standards," she announced to the cluster of women surrounding her. "One simply cannot imagine what qualities this country nobody possessed that could have tempted him into such an uncharacteristically precipitous union. But then, I suppose even the most discerning gentlemen occasionally fall victim to certain persuasions that respectable women would never employ." The silence that followed was absolute, every eye in the vicinity fixed upon Eleanor's burning face, and she felt the words strike her like physical blows, each syllable a confirmation of her deepest fears about how society would receive her. But before she could summon any response, Frederick stepped forward, and his voice, when he spoke, carried the cutting precision of a blade drawn in anger. "Mrs. Chamberlain," he said, his tone so cold that Eleanor saw the woman actually flinch. "I married my wife because I recognized in her a dignity and worth that you could not comprehend if you lived 1,000 years, and if I ever hear you speak of the Duchess of Ravenscroft with anything less than the respect her position demands, you will find yourself unwelcome in every house of consequence in England. And that is not a threat, but a promise from a man who has never made one he did not keep." The carriage lurched into motion as they departed Lady Seymour's gathering, and Eleanor sat in the velvet darkness with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, still trembling from the confrontation she had witnessed, still hearing the echo of Frederick's voice as he had dismantled Mrs. Chamberlain with words sharper than any blade. And she found herself stealing glances at the man seated across from her, his profile illuminated in fleeting flashes as the carriage passed beneath the gas lamps of Mayfair, his expression unreadable, yet somehow different from the cold mask he had worn for the entirety of their acquaintance. The sapphires at her throat felt impossibly heavy now, weighted with meaning she was only beginning to understand. And when Frederick spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it, stripped of the commanding authority that usually characterized his every utterance. "I apologize if my response to Mrs. Chamberlain caused you discomfort," he said, though there was no apology in his tone, only a weary acknowledgment. "But I find I cannot tolerate cruelty directed at those who do not deserve it, particularly from those whose own conduct would not bear close examination." Eleanor shook her head, wanting to tell him that she had not been discomfited, but rather astonished, moved in ways she could not articulate, and she heard herself asking why he had defended her with such ferocity when he owed her nothing beyond the protection of his name and the provision of his household. The question hung between them as the carriage wheels clattered over cobblestones, and Frederick was silent for so long that Eleanor thought he would not answer. But then he pulled off his gloves with deliberate movements and let his bare hands rest on his knees, and in that small gesture of informality, Eleanor sensed the walls around him shifting, cracking, allowing something true to emerge. "My mother was not born to the aristocracy," he said finally, his voice carrying the particular weight of memories long carried and seldom shared, "and she faced exactly the sort of vicious commentary you experienced tonight for all the years of her marriage, whispers about her unsuitability, speculation about what arts she had employed to trap my father, cruelty dressed up as concern for the standards of good society." Eleanor listened with her breath held as Frederick continued, describing a woman of grace and intelligence who had loved his father genuinely and been loved in return, yet who had been made to feel like an interloper in her own home by those who valued bloodlines over character, and who had eventually retreated from society entirely, spending her final years in the country where the whispers could not reach her, dying when Frederick was 17 with an apology on her lips for having embarrassed the family name. "I swore then that I would never allow anyone under my protection to suffer such treatment," Frederick said, and when he looked at Eleanor directly, she saw in his eyes not the cold duty she had expected, but something that looked almost like pain, and without conscious thought she reached across the space between them and laid her hand over his, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers, offering comfort she had never imagined this formidable man might need or accept. The morning of August 12th dawned with the heavy golden light of late summer pouring through the open windows of Eleanor's sitting room, carrying with it the scent of roses from the garden below, and the distant sounds of London stirring to life beyond the walls of Ravenscroft House, and Eleanor sat in the window seat with her embroidery forgotten in her lap, her hand resting unconsciously on the gentle curve of her belly that had begun to swell noticeably beneath the soft muslin of her mourning dress, the fabric having been let out twice now by the seamstress, who asked no questions but whose knowing eyes missed nothing. She had been married to Frederick for 10 weeks, and in that time the cold formality of their early days had softened into something she had not expected and dared not name, a comfortable rhythm of shared meals and quiet evenings in the library, of conversations that ranged from literature to politics to the management of his estates, of glances that lingered a moment too long and accidental touches that sent warmth flooding through her in ways that had nothing to do with the summer heat. The door opened without preamble, and Eleanor looked up to find Frederick himself entering with a bundle of roses cradled carefully in his arms, their deep crimson petals still beaded with morning dew, and her breath caught at the sight of this stern, formidable man carrying flowers as tenderly as he might carry something infinitely precious, his expression shifting from its habitual gravity to something almost hesitant as he crossed the room toward her. "I noticed these blooming in the south garden," he said, "and I recalled that you mentioned once preferring roses to any other flower, which was such a small admission of attentiveness that Eleanor felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, for she had mentioned it only once, weeks ago, in passing conversation she had not thought he was truly hearing. She rose to accept the flowers, and when their fingers brushed during the transfer, neither of them pulled away immediately, standing close enough that Eleanor could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could smell the clean scent of his shaving soap beneath the perfume of the roses, and she thought perhaps he might say something more, might bridge the careful distance they had maintained even as their hearts drew inexorably closer. But the moment shattered with a sharp knock at the door, and Frederick stepped back as a footman entered, bearing a silver tray with the Morning Post, and Eleanor watched the colour drain from her husband's face as he recognized the seal on the topmost letter, the distinctive mark that she herself remembered all too well from a ribbon given in a moonlit garden a lifetime ago. "James is returning to England," Frederick said, his voice gone flat and hard, in the way Eleanor had not heard since those first terrible days of their acquaintance, and when he looked at her, she saw in his eyes not just anger, but a fierce protectiveness that made her heart clench with feelings she could no longer pretend were merely gratitude. "He will not come near you," Frederick continued, crumpling the letter in his fist, and Eleanor believed him with a certainty that surprised her, for she had learned in these weeks that Frederick Ashworth was a man whose promises, once given, were kept at any cost, and the fear that had gripped her at the sight of that familiar seal began to ease, replaced by something stronger, something that felt remarkably like faith in the man she had married. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of Frederick's study on August the 15th, casting long shadows across the Persian carpet and illuminating the tension that had settled over Ravenscroft House like a gathering storm, and Eleanor sat in the leather chair by the fireplace, watching her husband pace before his desk with the coiled energy of a man barely containing violence, his jaw set in that hard line she had come to recognize as the precursor to either cold fury or devastating silence, and she had just opened her mouth to suggest they send word to the solicitor when the study door burst open without warning or announcement, and James Ashworth strode into the room as though he owned it, as though he had not fled to the continent, leaving destruction in his wake, as though the world owed him welcome regardless of his sins. Eleanor's breath seized in her chest at the sight of him, this man she had once believed she loved, now tanned and healthy from his travels, his golden hair artfully dishevelled, his smile carrying that same easy charm that had once made her believe in promises whispered in moonlit gardens, and she felt nothing but a cold clarity as she watched him survey the room with the casual arrogance of someone who had never faced true consequences for anything in his privileged life. Frederick had gone utterly still, a stillness more terrifying than any movement, and when he spoke his voice was so controlled that Eleanor could hear the murder beneath each precisely articulated word as he asked his brother what possible reason he could have for showing his face in this house. James laughed, actually laughed, and spread his hands in a gesture of wounded innocence as he explained that he had heard the most delicious rumor in Paris about his serious older brother marrying some country nobody in scandalous haste, and he simply had to return to see if it could possibly be true. And his eyes slid to Eleanor with an assessment that made her skin crawl, taking in her altered figure, her fine dress, the Ravenscroft ring on her finger, and his smile sharpened into something ugly as he offered his congratulations on landing so neatly on her feet. Frederick moved so fast that Eleanor barely saw it, crossing the distance between them and seizing James by the throat, slamming him against the bookcase with enough force to send leather volumes tumbling to the floor, and Eleanor was on her feet without conscious decision, her voice cutting through the violent tableau as she called Frederick's name with a steadiness she did not feel, and when he turned to look at her, she saw the struggle in his eyes between the man he wanted to be and the brother's blood he wanted to spill. "He is not worth destroying yourself," Eleanor said, holding his gaze, and she watched Frederick's hands slowly unclench from James's throat, watched him step back with visible effort, and in that moment she understood that her husband needed her as much as she had ever needed him, that their marriage born of scandal and duty had become something neither of them had expected, something worth protecting from the casual cruelty of the man now gasping for breath against the bookcase. James straightened his cravat with deliberate insolence, his eyes moving between Frederick and Eleanor with the calculating assessment of a man who had always talked his way out of consequences. And when he spoke, his voice carried that familiar, honeyed charm, now edged with something harder, as he observed that his brother had certainly moved quickly to claim what James had sampled first. A vulgarity so shocking that Eleanor felt the words like a physical blow, even as Frederick's hands clenched at his sides with the visible effort of restraint. "You will not speak of her that way," Frederick said, each word bitten off with the precision of a man holding murder in check by the thinnest thread. And James merely laughed again, pushing himself away from the bookcase and adjusting his coat as though they were discussing nothing more significant than the weather, explaining that he had come to request his quarterly allowance be increased, given that his expenses on the continent had been rather higher than anticipated, and surely Frederick would not begrudge his own brother a few additional comforts when he had so clearly acquired such unexpected domestic comforts of his own. Eleanor watched this exchange with a clarity she had not possessed 4 months ago, seeing now what she had been too desperate and lonely to recognize then. The complete absence of conscience behind those handsome features, the way James moved through the world taking what he wanted with no thought for the wreckage he left behind. And she understood finally that his promises in the garden had meant nothing to him, had been merely the words necessary to obtain what he desired from a woman foolish enough to believe them. "She is my wife," Frederick said, "and the child she carries will bear my name and inherit my title, and you will acknowledge her as the Duchess of Ravenscroft, or you will leave this house and never return." And there was something in his voice that made James's smile falter for the first time, a recognition, perhaps, that his indulgent older brother had reached a limit that could not be charmed or manipulated away. James's gaze flickered to Eleanor's rounded belly, and she placed her hand over it instinctively, protectively, no longer the frightened girl who had come to this house seeking rescue, but a woman who had found unexpected strength in a marriage she had never sought. And when James looked back at Frederick, there was something almost like respect in his eyes, grudging and resentful, but present nonetheless. "Very well," James said finally, offering Eleanor a mocking bow. "Your Grace, and the title that should have felt like victory tasted instead of ash and endings, of doors closing on a chapter of her life she was grateful to leave behind. Frederick rang for a footman to escort James out, and as his brother sauntered toward the door with characteristic carelessness, he paused to deliver one final observation, noting that Frederick had always wanted what James had. And perhaps Eleanor had been the one thing worth keeping after all. And then he was gone, leaving behind only the lingering scent of his cologne and the wreckage of assumptions Eleanor had carried for months about her own worth and the man she had married. The silence that followed James's departure stretched through the study like the aftermath of a storm, and Eleanor stood motionless beside Frederick's desk, watching her husband stare at the door through which his brother had vanished, his shoulders rigid beneath his coat, his hands still curled into fists at his sides, and she understood in that moment that whatever complicated history bound these two men had been irrevocably altered by what had just transpired, that Frederick had chosen her over the brother he had spent a lifetime protecting from consequences, and the weight of that choice settled over her like a mantle she was not certain she deserved to wear. "Frederick," she said softly, and when he turned to face her, she saw the rawness in his eyes before he could mask it, the pain of a man who had just confronted the full measure of his brother's callousness and found it even worse than he had feared. And she moved toward him without conscious thought, driven by an instinct to comfort that surprised her with its intensity, stopping only when she stood close enough to see the slight tremor in his jaw that betrayed the emotion he was fighting to control. He looked down at her with an expression she could not quite name, something between gratitude and wonder, and a fierce protectiveness that made her breath catch in her throat. And when he spoke, his voice was rough with feeling as he told her that she should not have had to witness that he had hoped to spare her from James's particular brand of cruelty. And Eleanor shook her head slowly as she replied that she was glad she had been present, that seeing James again had given her something she had not expected to find. "And what is that?" Frederick asked, his voice gentler now, and Eleanor considered her answer carefully before she spoke, wanting him to understand the truth that had crystallized within her during that terrible confrontation with the man who had once made her believe she was worthy of love, only to prove that his words meant nothing at all. "Clarity," she said finally, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that felt new and hard-won, and she explained that for months she had wondered what was so wrong with her that James could make promises and break them without a backward glance, had tortured herself with the belief that she must have been somehow insufficient or unworthy of the love she had thought he offered. But watching him today, she had understood at last that his abandonment had nothing to do with her failings and everything to do with his own. Frederick's expression shifted as he listened, and when she finished speaking, he reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his hands with a tenderness that made her heart ache in her chest, and he told her that she had never been unworthy of anything, that James's inability to recognize her value was a reflection of his own poverty of character and not any lack in her. And Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes as she leaned into his touch, understanding that this man who had married her out of duty was offering her something his brother never had, the simple gift of being truly seen. The days following James's departure settled over Ravenscroft House, like the quiet after a long illness, and Eleanor found herself moving through rooms that had begun to feel like home, with a new lightness in her step, a sense of possibility she had not permitted herself to feel since that terrible spring night when she had believed a charming man's empty promises and given away something she could never reclaim. But now, as August ripened toward September, and her body rounded with the unmistakable evidence of the child growing within her, she discovered that the shame she had carried like stones in her pockets had begun to dissolve, replaced by something warmer and more sustaining, a quiet pride in the life she was building with a man who had married her out of duty, but who looked at her, now with eyes that held far more than obligation. Frederick had changed since confronting his brother, or perhaps Eleanor had simply learned to read him better, to see past the stern facade he presented to the world and recognize the tender heart he protected so fiercely beneath. And she noticed now how he sought her company in small ways throughout each day, appearing in her sitting room with questions about household matters that surely did not require her input, lingering over breakfast until she finished her tea, suggesting evening walks in the garden when the summer heat had faded to something bearable. Lady Beatrice observed these developments with barely concealed satisfaction, her sharp eyes missing nothing as she watched her nephew orbit his wife like a planet drawn inexorably toward the sun. And one afternoon, when Frederick had excused himself to meet with his solicitor, she settled beside Eleanor on the drawing-room settee and declared that she had never seen her nephew so thoroughly undone, that the infamous Ravenscroft composure had finally met its match in a country gentleman's daughter who had somehow accomplished what a decade of society beauties had failed to achieve. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks at these words, protesting that Frederick had married her only because honor demanded it, that whatever kindness he showed her stemmed from duty rather than affection. But Lady Beatrice merely laughed and shook her head, explaining that she had known Frederick since he was a squalling infant and had watched him build walls around his heart after his mother's death, walls that no amount of duty could compel him to dismantle. And if Eleanor believed that the way he looked at her was merely obligation, then she was either blind or deliberately refusing to see what was plain to everyone else in this household. That night, Eleanor lay awake in her chamber, her hand resting on the swell of her belly where the child had begun to move, tiny flutters like butterfly wings that filled her with wonder and terror in equal measure, and she allowed herself for the first time to imagine a future where Frederick's tenderness might grow into something more, where the marriage that had begun in desperation might become a true partnership of hearts, and the hope that bloomed in her chest felt dangerous and precious and impossible to suppress any longer. September arrived with golden light and cooling breezes, and Eleanor found herself standing before the mirror in her dressing-room one morning, her hands pressed to the swell of her belly that now curved unmistakably beneath her mourning dress, marveling at how much had changed since that desperate June day when she had arrived at Ravenscroft House believing her life was over, and she was studying her reflection with something approaching wonder when she heard the door open behind her and turned to find Frederick standing in the doorway, his expression shifting from surprise to something softer as his gaze dropped to where her hands rested protectively over their child, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them charged with an awareness that had been building for weeks, an unspoken acknowledgement of the feelings that had grown between them like vines climbing toward sunlight. Frederick crossed the room slowly, his eyes never leaving hers, and when he stopped before her, Eleanor could see the question in his face, the uncertainty that looked so foreign on a man who commanded respect wherever he went, and she understood that he was asking permission for something, though she was not entirely certain what, until he reached out and placed his hand gently over hers where it rested on her belly, the warmth of his palm seeping through the thin muslin of her dress, and she felt tears spring to her eyes at the tenderness of the gesture, at the way he looked at her as though she were something precious rather than a problem he had been obligated to solve. He told her then, his voice rough with emotion he had spent a lifetime learning to suppress, that he had not expected this, had not anticipated that a marriage born of duty would become the center of his existence, that watching her move through his home and his life had awakened something in him he had believed long dead, and Eleanor listened with her heart pounding against her ribs as Frederick Ashworth, the cold and formidable Duke of Ravenscroft, confessed that he had fallen in love with his wife without meaning to, without wanting, but so completely that he could no longer imagine a life without her in it. Eleanor felt the tears spill down her cheeks as she reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the stern line of his jaw that she had learned could soften into gentleness. And she told him that she loved him too, that somewhere between his unexpected kindness on their wedding night and his fierce defense of her honor before all of society, she had given him the heart she had thought forever broken. And when Frederick lowered his head to kiss her, it was nothing like the desperate stolen moment in a garden that had led to her ruin, but something infinitely more precious, a promise sealed between two people who had found in each other not what they had expected, but exactly what they needed. And Eleanor knew as she melted into her husband's embrace that whatever challenges still lay ahead, they would face them together. The weeks that followed their declaration transformed Ravenscroft House in ways both subtle and profound, and Eleanor found herself marveling at how a home that had once felt like a gilded cage of obligation had become a sanctuary filled with warmth and quiet joy. For Frederick no longer retreated to his study after dinner, but instead joined her in the drawing room where they would read together or simply talk, sharing the thoughts and dreams they had both kept guarded for so long, and she learned that beneath his stern exterior lay a man of deep feeling who had simply never been shown that it was safe to let anyone see his heart. The servants noticed the change first, whispering among themselves about how His Grace smuttered now, how he lingered at breakfast and brought flowers from the garden with his own hands, how the Duchess had accomplished what no one had thought possible in softening their formidable master, and Lady Beatrice declared with characteristic bluntness that she had waited 15 years to see her nephew happy, and intended to enjoy every moment of watching him make a fool of himself over his wife. Eleanor's pregnancy progressed smoothly under Dr. Fairfax's attentive care, her body rounding with the life growing within her. And though she sometimes caught herself wondering if Frederick truly saw this child as his own, or merely as the unfortunate consequence of his brother's actions, he dispelled those fears one evening when he knelt beside her chair and placed his hands on her belly, speaking softly to the baby about the books he would read to them and the horses he would teach them to ride. And Eleanor wept at the tenderness in his voice, at the way he had chosen to love a child that bore no blood of his, simply because that child was part of her. They had not yet consummated their marriage in truth, though the kisses they shared had grown longer and more heated, and Eleanor found herself lying awake at night, aching for her husband in a way she had never experienced, understanding now that what had happened with James had been nothing like what stirred between her and Frederick, for this was desire built on the foundation of respect and genuine affection, rather than manipulation and false promises. One night in late September, as autumn began to paint the garden in shades of gold and crimson, Frederick came to her chamber as he often did to bid her good night, but instead of the chaste kiss they had shared for weeks, he lingered, his forehead pressed against hers, his breath unsteady, and when he asked if she would have him stay, Eleanor answered by drawing him down to her, and what followed was a revelation, gentle and passionate, and nothing like the hurried, shameful encounter in a moonlit garden that had begun this journey. For Frederick worshipped her with his hands and his lips and his whispered words of love, until Eleanor understood at last what it meant to be truly cherished by a man who saw her not as a problem to be solved, but as a gift he had never expected to receive. The morning of October the 3rd dawned clear and bright, and Eleanor woke to find Frederick already gone from their bed, though the warmth of where he had lain beside her still lingered in the sheets, and she smiled as she stretched languidly, marveling at how different her life had become from those dark, desperate days when she had believed herself ruined beyond redemption. For now she was loved, truly and completely loved, by a man who had married her out of duty but had chosen to give her his heart without reservation. And as she rose and rang for her maid, she felt the baby quicken within her, a flutter of movement that had grown stronger over the past weeks, a reminder of the new life that would soon join their family. She found Frederick in the breakfast room with Lady Beatrice, both of them looking up as she entered, with expressions that made her pause in the doorway, and it was Lady Beatrice who spoke first, her sharp eyes softening with something like maternal pride as she announced that she had just been telling Frederick it was high time they hosted a proper ball to introduce the Duchess of Ravenscroft to society on their own terms, not skulking into other people's gatherings, but commanding their own stage, where Eleanor could shine as she deserved. And though Eleanor felt a flutter of nervousness at the prospect, she saw Frederick watching her with such confidence in his gaze that she found herself agreeing before she could think of reasons to refuse. The weeks that followed were filled with preparations that consumed the household, with Lady Beatrice directing the chaos like a general marshalling troops, while Eleanor found herself consulted on every detail, from the flowers to the music to the menu, and she realized with dawning wonder that she was being treated not as an obligation to be managed, but as the true mistress of this great house, her opinions valued and her preferences honored. And when she mentioned this to Frederick one evening as they sat together in the library, he looked at her with genuine confusion and asked why she would expect anything else, for she was his wife and his partner and the mother of his child, and her word in this house was second only to his own. The night of the ball arrived with Eleanor dressed in a gown of deep emerald green that Lady Beatrice had insisted upon, declaring that it was time the new Duchess stopped hiding in pastels and claimed the attention she deserved. And as Eleanor descended the grand staircase to where Frederick waited, resplendent in black evening clothes, she saw his breath catch and his eyes darken with an admiration that made her cheeks flush with pleasure. And when he took her hand and pressed a kiss to her gloved fingers before leading her into the ballroom, where 200 of society's most influential members waited to judge her, Eleanor felt not fear, but a fierce, triumphant joy, for she knew that whatever whispers might follow her through that glittering crowd, she had already won the only prize that mattered.